today is about really managing much more than teaching itself. And there's a few things that I think are really essential, and we'll focus on those. One of the first ones is just being organized. And there's a lot of levels to that. But part of being organized, you have your water bottle, you have your slide advancer, preferably it has active batteries so that you can point out what you want them to see. Also, my advancer was getting older and older and older, and that meant I had to be closer and closer and closer. I finally got a new one. Now I can be 100 feet away, and I can still operate this thing. Little things like that, being set up in advance are really helpful. Another thing that I like to do in today's world is after I play music before class, I turn off the music, and I make sure that everybody sees that I silence my phone. You want to emulate the behaviors that you expect from your students. If you don't do it, why should they? If they don't see you do it, they don't know. All right? So little subtle things. Now, obviously, a lot of these things aren't going to won't occur or be part of their behavior until over time. But they see repetition. They see you doing things. They're more likely to emulate you and adopt those. And the nice thing is oftentimes there's carry forward. So if you have them again or somebody else says them, you might get a thank you later. You never know. So I want to start off with a little bit about personal philosophy. And that is, what is the college experience? You're dealing with people that are in a completely different place in their life. They're exceedingly naive. They know what they've been through. They know what the education system is up to the point you received them. But, what do they really know? Okay, go back to one of the cartoons at the beginning. What life skills do you have? I can take tests. That's something our students are really good at. So you need to think about who your audience is and what you want from them. Okay, what is that college experience? Some people frame the college experience as what they do outside of the classroom. Some people frame it in terms of what they do as extracurricular activities within the university. Some people think about it as the classes that they take, or some composite of it. But I think about it as their entire lifespan. All right? It's not any single part of it. It's a pretty intense period. They're not naive. They're novices. They're being stressed in a variety of different ways. We need to make sure that we recognize that. I didn't say we need to lessen the stress. That's a separate issue. But the idea that we're helping them to develop, we're helping them to go through all this growth is really important. And then what is education? Boy, that's a really difficult thing to define. It sounds like one of the, when somebody says it, you feel comfortable, you know what it is, until you have to actually answer it. Because education varies as depending upon where they're at in the whole spectrum. All right? Education is going to mean something different to a kindergartner and a first grader than it would be to a senior in high school. And now they're moving out of the house. They're going somewhere else, at least the majority of our students. They're in an independent environment. Nobody's got their thumb on them anymore. It's a different setting. So you have to consider what education is and what do you think it should be. I could add into this, it's a lifelong journey. It doesn't start, or I should say it starts the day you're born, but it doesn't really end until you either stop learning purposefully or you die. Now we know a lot of people who meet the first category, unfortunately, but I hope that as an educator, you instill a desire to continue this process. And then things to ponder. We have all the political environment about educators and teachers. Oh, they have to do this, they must do that. Our teachers suck, blah, blah, blah. Most of that's crap. They have a bad environment to work in when you hear all this negative stuff. It makes it hard to be good. It makes it hard for the students to take you serious if the parents don't take you serious. We're a little bit isolated at the college level, so that helps us. But things that you have to keep in mind is that you cannot take personally your students' results. You know, as an instructor, as a teacher, however you wish to phrase that, you know, your students' performance does not necessarily reflect what you did in the classroom. Right? You can't make them learn. You can't make them study. You can't make them prepare or think. But what you can do is to try and emulate those behaviors and encourage those behaviors. Maybe in some cases you have to tell them what those behaviors are. I spent, I don't know, probably about 10% of my classroom time so far this semester talking about what is involved in learning and strategies to learn. I mean, and some of it's just simple. Look for patterns. You know, things that you and I probably think are obvious may not be so to your students. So you have to help them. And then, of course, you can't learn anything for your students. Despite the old saying, I'll learn you, which we know is inappropriate grammar, you know, your students have to be willing to do the work. They have to be engaged. They have to do the learning. So then your job as the instructor is to help foster that environment that will encourage that. Help give them the tools that'll do that. If they think you're on their side, they'll have a much better viewpoint. By the way, if you haven't noticed, that doesn't matter what size your class is. You know, how you might approach it will vary, you know, in a small classroom compared to a large classroom. That's fine. But it's still the same basic things. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about, we'll start off with what are common issues that are presented by students, particularly in larger classrooms. We'll also talk about concerns by faculty. And then what I would describe as the 4 essentials. Right? You cannot be successful in a class if you're not organized. And the organization is multi-tiered. Right? Your students will see that you're not organized and they don't take you as serious. Then we get into cultivating relationships. There's a lot of little ways to do that. You saw the cartoons at the beginning. You know, humor goes a long way. If you can, you know, relate that humor to what you're going to talk about that day, or maybe what you talked about last time. I play music before class. There's a lot of ways to accomplish that. And then help your students to understand. We're not going to go a lot into technique today. It'll be much more about management. But we will talk about things that will help your students to start to understand what's necessary. And then last but not least, if you do not enjoy this process, it shows. It will show. And your students will notice it. If anything, the students are completely unaware of nonverbal language as far as what they communicate to you, but they know what they see. And they read your nonverbal language. All right? And if you're not having a good time, you will broadcast that. So those will be our topics for today. So starting off, common issues reported by faculty. Management, paperwork. I mean, this is, I know we live in the digital era, so that kind of takes on a different connotation. But you guys are familiar with Blackboard, right? Students can submit assignments in Blackboard. We can grade in Blackboard. We can create the rubrics. That all takes time management up front. You know, and it's a way of reducing the actual papers in your office so you don't fill up a filing cabinet. But it still takes the same amount of time, if not more. You know, managing distractions. How do you deal with students coming in late? How do you deal with students who want to leave early? You know, 5 minutes till, it's not uncommon to see students start packing up. And, you know, little things like that. You know, some things, you should have rules for your classroom, but as a general statement, don't create a rule that you cannot enforce. You know, that sounds really obvious. I see people try and do that, and you know, you lessen your own credibility, your effectiveness. Perceived anonymity. A lot of students like to sit in the back, particularly in the back center. They might not be able to escape as quickly, but you'll never know their name unless you go ask it. Flexibility. Large classrooms are notoriously inflexible, particularly if you're in a stadium-style seating class. Here, you could start to say this would be a large classroom. You can fit about, 54 people in here, I think. Large is somewhere around 60, plus or minus, right? You could reorganize your classroom here into groups. This would be a far more flexible environment. But if you go to somewhere that has fixed seating, no, you have to manage things very differently. You would not break down into groups of 4 because it would be a great deal more difficult, chaotic. The movement alone would be disruptive. Your students come from a variety of backgrounds. I mean, you can talk about socioeconomic status, cultural backgrounds, the whole bit, but even what they consider to be education. So you're battling, maybe battle's not the best choice of word, but you have to confront and face an enormous diversity of students walking into your room and their level of preparedness. So that gets into a whole separate issue about engagement. Most people, you know what you see, right? We're all guilty of that at some level. But you don't know what you don't see or don't observe. However, the education literature suggests that a lot of the students who don't speak up, don't respond to questions, even as a group, are still actively engaged in the classroom environment. Just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it's not there. And at least when I say measure, you can't visually mark, okay, that was the behavior that I observed. But yet, if you were to give them a quiz, those students would do pretty well on the quiz of the material you just covered. Engagement, really, as you just pointed out, takes a lot of different forms. Some people can quasi-multitask. Some of us can't. I was always impressed. My brother-in-law could watch a baseball game, have a conversation with my mother, and study finance. I don't know. Either finance is really easy, or he's a lot more talented than I am. I'm going with the second one. What kind of things do students talk about? Okay. Well, they don't know this stuff. It's their first time. That means we have to be a little bit patient and recognize that. We have to be careful with the assumptions that we make. If you're teaching in your area of specialty, you're going to use terminology or phrases that they are not so familiar with. An example, yesterday I was reading a journal article. I know this is outside the classroom, but the language that was used in this particular article, it was a biomechanics study, I found relatively confusing. They were talking about rotation of the hip and rotation of the knee as though they're two independent things. And I'm like, well, how do you rotate the hip? You can rotate the spine. Are the two relative? Well, they were actually talking about rotation of the femur as rotation of the hip. And I had to go through and decipher all that. But I spent more time trying to do that than reading the study. Your students are in a similar boat. If they're not familiar with the vernacular, they have to spend a lot of time getting up to speed. So our job is to bring it down to a level where they can start to grasp it and then help them attain the level of mastery that's expected. Students are afraid of looking dumb. Go figure. They experience the same things we did. Nobody wants to look dumb. Some people are willing to take more risks than others. There's the nerd curse. You don't want to be that student, who answers every question in the class. My son in med school was concerned about this. He's doing his rotations right now, and he found himself trying to answer every question on those rotations, even the ones that were supposed to be really hard. I'm like, be careful. Even I'm cautioning him on that one. A lot of students just lack skills, starting with time management. I mean, you'd be surprised at the variety of skills that the students lack. Some students will come in with certain skills but not others. You can't make your assumptions is really where that's going. Time management is probably one of the more important ones. But then the other side of it is go back to one of the first things. What is education? And if education means that you do more than memorize pieces of information, I'm really big into application. By the end of the term, they should be able to, put things together, look for those patterns. There's a lot of things that you may have to help your students with. It depends upon what level of students you're working with. I deal a lot with sophomores. They're really in it. When they come into my classes, they're an advanced high school student. That is the best description. By the time they finish the 2-course sequence, they should be an upperclassman. And that's a pretty big step. That's a pretty healthy change. All right. So, you can use that to your advantage. And then, of course, there's the whole anonymity bit. Some students want to be anonymous. Some students are anonymous for other reasons. So then, what can you do to help make your class successful and improve that environment? Be organized. Okay. I thought about borrowing from the Boy Scouts and say, be prepared, but I think that's kind of included in the be organized. Start with designing your course early. What do you want your students to know? Start with the end product. You've probably heard a lot of this before, but being organized is what you do before the semester. Matter of fact, if you're creating a new course, that should be what you're doing. You're setting it up at that point in time. What do you want them to get out of it? You should have a syllabus that's fairly clear, lists the expectations, both academically with your learning outcomes, but also, rules, what are you going to be evaluated, how you're going to be evaluated, the whole 9 yards. And you should make sure that it's clear that they get that as well. Are you going to use Blackboard for more than just displaying grades? I give online assessments before we start a chapter in A&P so that they look at stuff ahead of time. Because what do students not do? Read ahead, right? There are little tools that you can use to help yourself. But those take an enormous amount of time to establish. And then you're always going to be limited by the number of students that you have. If you have a lot of students, you're not going to do a lot of written assignments. That's a management nightmare. Of course, in my case, and in Ashley's case, we have teaching assistants that can help with a lot of that. So I do still trudge through those whenever possible. But if I didn't have the TAs, I don't think I would give essays on my exams. What do you do before each class? Well, again, it's a matter of be prepared. I mean, the obvious is you're going to review your slides. But what may not be so obvious is what do you do in that interim between reviewing your slides and you begin lecture? So this semester, my classes are on the other side of Pickens. So I have a nice little walk. I get my lifestyle activity in. Got to spin everything with a positive, right? But there's the other positive to this. And as I'm walking across campus, I'm not thinking about my slides. I'm thinking, okay, what is it that I want them to get out of this today? My slides are going to help me get there. But what do I think are the big things? And how can I try and convey that in a more conversational tone? Sometimes I think that's one of the things that surprises people. It's not the slides. The slides are actually my lecture notes. As I tell my students, these aren't really for you. They're to help me know what I want to talk about next. And by the way, that's even true today. I would never remember to say all this. Think about what kind of questions you're going to get. If you've taught the class before, you got a pretty good idea. You might even think about, well, what were the things that came up as you were making this lecture? What are the more common things? Or what kind of discussions have you had with your faculty that might relate to this? Or your kids, or who knows? You should always be prepared to ask questions. This is one of those things that aids in that active learning, that engagement. Students will pay more attention. They may surf a little bit, but they're still going to keep an ear out because they know that a question's going to come. You can put questions on your slides. You can use those questions to slow the pace of your class down. You can use those questions to direct where you want your students to go. And so you're going to test over this topic. Probably 5%, 10% of your exam is going to cover this topic. Why not hit them with a question that's kind of overarching? Make them think about it. And then you can either have that as a class discussion. You can break down into groups, 1-minute papers. There's a whole lot of ways that it can be a nice segue into a new topic for a class. And then, Plan B. Okay. Now, Plan B today means something a little bit different than it did several years ago, thanks to the pharmaceutical industry. But there are a lot of little things that you can do with Plan B. Say a student, yeah. I teach anatomy and physiology. I actually get to discuss those things. Those are fun topics. And sometimes students will go off on tangents, which is a lot of fun. And if we can keep it as anatomy and physiology, we're all for it. But there are a lot of ways to think about Plan B. So what if a student asks you a question that you don't have a slide to answer it with? Well, neat little thing. Digital drawing pad. Now, a lot of times the podiums are not very well equipped, but I can sit up here and, I can draw things out. I can draw the neuron and where it interacts with the skeletal muscle fiber. I can draw my anatomical structures here, the T-tubules, along with the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And we can talk about how muscle contracts. And I can walk them through the anatomy, and then we can talk about how the physiology fits into that. So having this kind of flexibility in a large room, particularly rooms where a whiteboard doesn't work very well, or some classes don't even have whiteboards, gives you a flexibility to address a student on the fly. But that does require you to be prepared. Other things to think about is, let's see. What if the projection system doesn't work? You've all experienced that. Most rooms on campus, you can get away with that. By the way, if you hit B when you're in Blackboard presentation mode, the screen goes black. If you don't know. But that's when you have your markers. And you come and you can still see your screen. Or maybe you have some other kind of note. But now you can do things in class. You've got backup. The nursing building, the big auditorium, there's no backup plan for that room. You reschedule your day. Now, said that, there's a caveat. You guys all have PowerPoint, right? You can record over your slides. There's the recordings if you have a microphone. So like with the storm, I recorded my lecture over my slides. I broke them up into smaller components and converted them to an MP4 file, and you can post them on Stream, which you now have access to. And Blackboard, you can link to that Stream file. So your students can watch the video, but they can't download it. And I've gotten to the point now where in some of my classes, I will probably spend 35, 40% of the semester drawing. I've gotten comfortable enough with that. And some students hate it. But those are the students that just want to know what the facts are. Sergeant Friday, just the facts, ma'am. And then they want to regurgitate the facts. Well, we got to try and change those students. You know, ways to change that? Well, is to get them to start doing things. So other things to be organized with. Well, you can be organized during your class. Okay. Arrive early. You never know when the projection system's not going to work or whatnot. I couldn't get the sound to work in one of the rooms the other day. Getting there early usually helps you deal with those things. And if you get set up, well, now you can go mingle with your students. You know, start in the front row at the very minimum, hit the aisles. You know, if the students get to know you, they're going to be a lot more comfortable. They'll ask more questions in class or outside of class. You'll probably get more emails, unfortunately, but that's not the worst thing that can happen. Show a passion. Be energetic. Part of that means don't stand behind the podium. Okay, walk around. I mean, you see me pacing around. Jim Carson used to tell me that was the worst thing about my presentations. And it's one of the things my students like the most. I don't stand back there. I'm not protected from my students. You know, again, that nonverbal communication really goes a long ways. And thanks to my new remote, I do walk around a lot more. And I will come back towards the back portions of the class. And now I can see what the students are surfing about, you know. I like to use in-class lecture quizzes. You know, one of the things, you know, late arrivals to class. I have found a way to discourage late arrivals, and that is quiz. I start class on time, I end class on time. My quiz is where I'm starting my class. You know, you find students make an effort to get to class on time. This semester, I've had a surprisingly large number of students say that they are having to cross campus. My Tuesday, Thursday class is in McMaster, which is a nice little haul from here, but they're coming from Darla Moore, which is even a little bit more of a challenge when you consider, you know, the extra couple lights that they have to pass through. So I have waited to make sure that my classroom looks full. I know the faces, and if they're there, I will start the quiz right away. If not, I may give them a couple minutes to ask questions. But that will prompt your students. They will get there on time. My quiz is up for 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes, it comes down. Be flexible. Flexibility comes in a variety of different ways. One of them is you ask the students questions. One of them is saying, okay, what questions do you have for me? Okay, I know I have not done the best job or a perfect job, or maybe there's something that you didn't catch, or, you know, how can I help you? And then after class, reflect. That's one of those other things we want our students to do associated with their studying. You know, you want to take time to reflect. How did you think that the lecture went that day? You know, or the classroom activities? What seemed to work? What seemed to not work? You know, as you were reviewing the room, what kind of signals were you getting, the nonverbal cues? You know, you might even, if a couple students are slow to leave, you might even ask. There's a lot of things you can do, but you're not going to get better if you're not thinking about it and reflecting on it. You know, students oftentimes will be happy to give you feedback. You do have to be concerned that they don't want to give you negative feedback because they don't want to, you know, hurt their grade for reasons. So be careful with some of what they tell you. But and then Larry Durstein always talked about, you know, when you develop a new course, the first time you teach it, you learn more than your students, and the second time, you probably still learn more. And about the third or fourth time, it's about a break even, you know. But hopefully you are learning something in this process. Maybe it's about the content, maybe it's about your teaching, maybe it's about your students and where they're at and how, you know, you may need to change how you approach things. This should be a dynamic environment in a number of ways. It's not just the traditional sage on the stage. You shouldn't just get up there and talk at them. That's part of the fun. You get up and have conversations before class starts, you know, and then other students feed into it and they hear something, and it can be really enjoyable. And then, oh yeah, exam day. Teaching large classes, I've had upwards of 265 students in one room at a time. Exams can be an interesting experience because they're really stressed. They're worried about things. Half of them are operating on limited amounts of sleep. You never know what's going to be said before the exam starts just because of those kinds of things. But being organized is really important here. So little things, make multiple keys. So you guys should have the handout. This is a copy of one of my old exams, and if you look at the bottom of the page, it says A1 and A2. Depending upon how many students I have in a class, I may have up to 5 keys. They're all the same exam. I happen to have a piece of software, thanks to the publisher of the book I use, that allows me to make one test, produce 5 different variants. Press of a button. It will give me, let's see, it'll reorder the questions, and it'll reorder the answers in any multiple choice questions or matching questions. So that's pretty nice. But you want to have this set up. And if you're going to do large classrooms, you're probably going to do Scantrons, right? Scantrons will make your life a lot easier. Well, if you do 5 different keys, you're going to have to fill out 5 different keys. One of the things that I learned in doing all this, however, is that when you format your test, you want to have the same layout on every test. So here I start with multiple choice questions. You want all 5 keys to have the first whatever number of questions multiple choice. And then if you do matching, and then if you have true, false, and so forth. Because that makes filling out the form for scanning services a lot easier. And if you're not careful, you end up having questions that an open-ended question, a fill in the blank or something, in the middle of your answer key, which creates a problem for scanning services. All right. So formatting your exam booklet is really important, and producing multiple keys. I've had people tell me, "Oh, well, I color code my tests." Ooh, you're gonna give the code away? I was joking with my class yesterday about that as I was alerting them to the format of the exam next week. Which, by the way, wasn't the first time I told them that, but they sure seemed to think it. What I was joking with them about was that I was going to do 1/3 of each key in white, 1/3 in blue, and 1/3 in pink. So that, it'd really mess them up. They really wouldn't be able to know. I told them I wasn't going to go do that much work for it. So just having a little fun with them, but letting them know what to anticipate. What you're really trying to do with this is make your life easier and decrease the likelihood they're cheating. You can't stop them cheating, but you can make it more difficult and hopefully make it obvious if they are. Now, I think I gave you pretty much the whole exam, so you can see I do offer short essay questions, depending upon whether it's A&P 1 or 2, it'll be 4 to 6 questions. I have TAs. My TAs do the grading. Because with 200 plus students, that doesn't work. Now, I didn't put the order of this together very well. If you flip to the page where we have the printing services, and then on the other page you see scanning services. If you have a large classroom, we're supposed to have our exams printed at printing services over at the Russell House. We're not supposed to use the copiers in our department. That doesn't mean people don't. But I think that's like, if you have more than 30, I think you're supposed to use that. Yeah. So there's a file. You can go to the Russell House printing site, and it's a PDF that you can fill out, and it'll automatically print in triplicate. And then you sign that, and all 3, and then you have to take it over. There are some basic things. I print double-sided, collated, staple. I just use white paper. I don't bother colored stuff. If somebody has a vision problem, I don't want to mess them up. That's my philosophy. You can send your test over in a digital format and then take the paperwork over later. But and they need at least 24 hours. Sometimes they're busy. Sometimes. But then on the other side, scanning form. So scanning services is down off Wheat Street across from the Green Quad. You enter the building under the awning. And they're nice people down there. You take the scanning form in with the Scantrons. You know, you have to make sure everything is lined up in the same order. All the A keys are together, the B keys, and then your answer key is on top and marked clearly. Otherwise, they'll delay getting you your results. All right. But there are some things that you can fill out here that are pretty interesting. So I get my grades in the Excel format. Otherwise, you have to copy from PDF, and errors occur if you're not careful. I will check grades by name. I do the item analysis summary, and I will do the student sheets. Now, in all this, if you flip to the page in front of this, I will show you a copy of the item analysis summary. And it'll give you a question by question analysis. Percentage of students that got right, or question 1 right. And then what's the distribution and it's in 27%. I've never understood that. So it's the top 27% and it's the bottom 27%. Why wouldn't you do a quartile? I mean, it's not even a third. It's an odd value. But that is essentially how they also then calculate the biserial. And if it's a positive biserial, it means students who did well tended to do well on this question. And if it's a negative biserial, it's inverted. The students who didn't do well on your exam tended to do well on that question, meaning that that's a suspect question. And that's how I like to use this. If I have a low percentage accurate response rate, I go in and I inspect the question. Was the key marked correctly? Is the question worded funny? I look for all kinds of crazy things. That doesn't mean I throw it out. I have questions that will appear on an exam. Some semesters I'll have a 40% accurate response rate. Other semesters I have 13. It varies. And just, you know, I've tested that question. I'm not tossing it out. They weren't prepared. But it is a clue. If you haven't had a chance to evaluate your stuff, this is a good way to go back and look. You know, and this is how I find out if a key was mismarked or if it's a bad question. Now, so I like the item analysis summary. Don't get the detailed one because it's several pages long, and then you have what you need here, unless you're really, really, really into exams. I did not provide you an example of the student sheet just because of confidentiality concerns. Yeah, I probably could have found a way to mark out all the pertinent information. But what it does is if a student comes by your office, they can look at what questions they missed. And you can print it out only for the students who come to your office. And in a large classroom, I make students come to me. That way I get to talk to them and meet them. But those kinds of things, students like if they come and they get meaningful feedback. And then they can say, okay, well, this is what I did well on, you know, yeah, when I was studying this, I really didn't spend a lot of time. Or, you know, this never made sense to me. And then you can make your little notes and that'll reflect in future lectures and future semesters. All right? So being prepared is really important. But during the exams, phones are off, no watches, smart watches. They don't allow them. Bluetooth, if they're anywhere close to the bag, what is the distance? It's what, 100 feet now? No watches. And their bags are in the front of the room. All they can have is something to write with. Most of the time, I even restrict water. That sounds mean. I fully support the Disability Services Office. And if a student comes to me with any kind of question related to it, I just tell them, you probably are better off to schedule your test over there. All right? You know, whether they need the extra time or not, but there they can be flexible. You know, in a large classroom, that can be really difficult. I mean, it's hard for me to say, no, you can't have water, but you can. So yeah, make use of that. as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it can be a little bit of an inconvenience, but they can scan your exams and send them to you. So it's not as bad as it used to be. It used to be you had to walk over and pick it up or wait for it to come via campus mail. So, I do encourage students to ask questions during the exam. You just have to be careful. Most of them are probing questions, and you have to shut those down pretty quick. You know, it's like, I can't answer that. That'll give you the answer to the question. But sometimes it's really simple. I have found that undergraduates don't know what the word conduit means. You know, I mean, not that that's a common word, but it's not an uncommon word. And I've yet to rewrite that question to remove it. I don't think about it in time. That's something I will answer. I will help them with. In some cases, it's clear that they really just can't understand the question. So then you probe them to then help them to consider what they're reading. But you try and avoid answering the question for them. But they should feel like you're working in their best interest. And you're willing to help them, even if you don't tell them the answers. They understand the difference. Students are anything but dumb. All right, they are not dumb, regardless of what we sometimes may think. Turn the exam around quickly. You know, with 200-seat class, my TAs typically would grade either the night of the exam or the night after, so I could get everything back to them within 48 hours. Tell them what to expect. You know, be upfront with it. They will appreciate it. And if you get it back within that 48 hours, they're going to say, "Wow, that was fast. You know, I really appreciate you doing that."
If you use a Scantron, what is their turnaround time?
Most of the time, well, it depends on when you turn it in. So if you turn it in the morning, you'll have it early afternoon. If you turn it in at the end of the day, usually it'll be the next morning. It also depends on, is that a really busy week? They actually will extend their hours. Oddly enough, during the busy weeks, you might get it the same day, even if you put in at 4. Technically, they close at 4:30, but they don't always close at 4:30. And even if they lock the door at 4:30, they still work. No, you're going to turn it in the next day. But they are pretty good about it. I've had errors crop up. They'll turn it around and fix it really quick. If a student doesn't bubble in their name, oftentimes they can identify it because they have access to your roster. Or if you have multiple students, they'll just list them and the exam number. Oh, yeah. Go back to the first page of the exam. That's something I didn't think to talk about. Speaking of that, if you look on the top of the first page, you see ID. Okay. All your Scantrons come with an ID. You write that ID on the exam booklet so you can match the two. I've had that save a number of students. So that's a tip. Now, my students write on my exam booklets, so they have to have their name on it. But those will help communicate some things. Save your headache. On the printout, the student sheet printout, if you go through each one of those, you can just, if you set it so that it fits one page, you can just hit the down arrow, page through it, and you can look. They'll report missing questions that a student didn't bubble in underneath the table. So it's easily identifiable. And if I'm being really nice that semester, I will go find that student's exam and see if they marked it on the exam booklet. And I will then give them credit for it. I also reward students for bubbling in their name, marking their key. If I don't have to do anything extra for them, I spot them 2 points on the exam. If I have to go do something besides this is the one thing I will give them. But if I have to figure out what key they had or any of this other stuff, I dock them. They don't get those 2 points. Now, there's if you look down here at the bottom, I got this from CTE Center over in Lubbock at Texas Tech. I certainly didn't feel the need to reinvent the wheel. It's a pretty nice set out. And this is most of what they consider to be best practices. These are best practices regardless of class size. Now there's one thing I did not put in there from theirs, and that is learning style. And if you read the education literature, if you read the old education literature, they talk about learning styles. And if you read the new education literature, they say it's all garbage. All right? And I tend to agree with that. You know, going back to my A&P emphasis, what I tell my students is you learn things 5 ways, okay? Vision, sound, taste, touch, and what's the other one? Smell, thank you. Yes, sometimes I do forget these things. You acquire all your information through your senses. You may connect pieces and draw logical conclusions, but you learn through your sensory input. All right, and then it's what you do with it that matters. People may have preferences. I know I have preferences. I like to look at pictures. And then if I'm not convinced that I got all what I need out of that picture, then I go read the text. You know? There's nothing wrong with preferences, but there is something wrong with the idea that people think there's only one way that they can learn. You know, don't try and do too much. Pause. Build in pauses if you have trouble pausing. You know, what? Blank slide. Sometimes you just put a question mark on it. Open the floor up. Tell them why you do what you do. I explain why I use the torturous methods that I do. I'm pretty upfront. Yeah. And as we'll talk about here in a moment, you should develop a rapport. That's why you want to get to class early, get set up, talk to your students. Encourage them to come to your office. If one comes to your office and they find out that you really don't bite heads off, then more will start to come. You probably won't be overwhelmed. And then, you know, start simple. Don't do everything. Yeah. You guys are educated individuals. You know, oftentimes we have grandiose ideas because, no, tone it down. So then this is about that rapport, cultivating relationships. You know, I tend to be somewhat flippant at times. I am a very sarcastic individual and whatnot, so I have to be careful not to say things that imply that I don't care. Because the reality is I am very concerned about my students. All right? They have to believe it. If they don't believe it, then they don't buy in. They're not going to develop in the manner that helps them not only today, tomorrow, but next semester. So how do you cultivate these relationships? Well, start with being yourself. I've been asked, well, what if you're an introvert? Well, I can tell you that. I'm an introvert. Most people don't know what introvert means. Introvert means that you like social activity, but it wears you out. And then you become a recluse until you recover, and then you become social again. It's not being shy. You know, people who are shy will deal with similar related stuff because, you know, the environment can be overwhelming. But it starts with being yourself. But you may need to adopt a persona. When I'm in front of 200 students, I'm Dr. Thompson. You know, it is me. I mean, it's a genuine me, but it's kind of that part of me that I can now do whatever I have to do, and then when everything's done, I can go back and I can withdraw if I need to, and the whole bit. It has the advantage of providing you with the energy that you think you're going to have. And large lectures, large classrooms require a lot of energy. You know, you can't be passionate without energy of some sort. How you display it will vary. You know, let the students have a little bit of insight into who you are, what you like. I get to talk about a lot of things, and somehow or another, I find ways to relate things back to food, which, by the way, I really love. I'll make use of my kids. I have a 15-year-old, and sometimes I've gotten frustrated with him related to school, and I'll make a relationship to what I want my own students to do, or I'll talk about how my son that's in med school used to come home from college and take my tests just for fun, no effort to prepare, and he might get a 60% without preparing. Yeah, my students are like, and you can say, I've had exams where the average was a 65. Yeah, you can learn this stuff. Tell stories. And I do mean your lecture. You should have a flow. And maybe that day is a series of small stories, vignettes. Maybe it's from beginning to end. Maybe it's a story that covers 2 or 3 days. It's okay. Encourage questions. Ask them questions if they don't ask you. Explain why you do things. It's part of that honesty. I'm all about humor. I make fun of myself. I try not to make fun of a student per se, but I will make fun of behaviors that are considered common. Things that I was also guilty of when I was a student. So, provide examples, relevant examples, but also don't be afraid to use analogies and go for the odd ones. I was talking, a student was having trouble understanding how a hormone can bind to a receptor. And I described it as it's a drive-by. It's a drive-by shooting. Okay? The hormone binds to the receptor, causing the receptor to change shape and then falls off. And then another one can come along and do the same thing. And as soon as I said that, it's like the lights went on and it all made sense to how this isn't a permanent interaction between these two molecules. And like I said, sometimes those crazy analogies are what help them make those connections, something that they would be familiar with from their own environment. Oh yeah, this is my worst skill, or I should say my least strong skill, is responding to student emails. If you do it, you will have a much better semester. I work to get better at it every semester. I think right now I'm operating at about 95% this term, so I'm doing pretty good. So make sure you're working to do the obvious things. But then what about the non-obvious things? I'm a big Scooby fan. Not old enough to have seen it, first time. They were all reruns by the time I came along. But there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of fun. I like to post humorous slides at the beginning of class. Whenever possible, they're relevant to the topic, but I think this one's pretty fun because it's actually kind of poking fun at me. Because if you go back to Scooby, who were the monsters? They were the adults. And here I am torturing my students. I like to play music. I do have a Spotify account. I have a whole list of songs that I will play. I try to make sure that I don't do anything inappropriate. Sometimes, and I do a wide range of music. I chose this particular band first because I think the name is just absolutely hilarious. It's also a quasi-punk band that does covers. So it's nothing like listening to a punk version of Paula Abdul. So then why should your students show up to class? I will show them this information. I give lecture quizzes. Usually they're unannounced. They're always at the beginning of class. And here you can see if they pass the lecture quiz, or at this point, if it's about attendance. So if they were present for every lecture quiz, or they missed a lecture quiz. And then what was their likelihood of passing? And you can see that showing up to a lecture quiz is definitely associated with a higher passing rate. And then what about their performance on the lecture quizzes? Doing well on the lecture quizzes is highly associated with doing well in the course. And that's if you calculate their performance in the course without the lecture quizzes, which is only like, I don't know, an 18th of the score. So give them cause to want to take you serious. Come to class. I tell them it's a free study session. You know, and you get a little bit of insight into the way I think, therefore the way I write my questions. Okay. Make class relevant. Okay. You don't give away answers on your exams. You don't give away exam questions, but you do clue them into your exams and how to prepare, how to address it. Yesterday we talked about exam taking strategies. And boy, that was like, huh? You mean I don't start at number one? You know, I personally don't post any course outlines, but I do post readings, and those readings out of the chapters are selected. That's the emphasis. I'm personally kind of opposed to the whole outline lecture, providing them with lecture notes. I think that's a skill that they have to develop. That's my opinion. You're welcome to something different. Do provide the signed readings. Depending upon the lecture, the course, the semester, I will provide the lecture slides. Sometimes I provide it as the narrated slides, where in other terms I will provide the whole lecture without narration. You know, unless there's some, you know, private data on your slides, I'm not really sure why we should worry about hiding it. It's like it's proprietary. Technically, we're working at the university. This is part of our job. The university actually owns those lectures, just like they own your syllabus. Don't be afraid to supplement. You know, if you don't like the picture that's in your text, go find another one. Create your own. You know, use questions, whether it's case studies, scenarios, or whatnot. By the way, there is the whole bit with formative assessments. Formative assessment can be something you give or something they do for themselves, but it's essentially taking a quiz or test of some sort, and they get the feedback right away. And that's what I like to do with my lecture quizzes, is treat them as a real formative assessment. I only tie points to them, which are very small, because I want them to study as the semester goes on, not wait till the days before the test. All right? But it's still technically defined as a formative assessment because you give them immediate feedback and it's low stakes, although they may not realize that. You should state any policies. I've never used the 10% rule, although I've had the opportunity to do so. I have had a student that got a B on all my exams, didn't take most of the lecture quizzes or do the Blackboard assignments, and he got a D. That's the points he earned. I'm not changing the rules for him. But I've never lowered somebody's grade. That's what I have not done. And that's what that rule allows you to do. So here's an example of a formative assessment. So beginning class, I show them my questions. Normally it's out of 5. Sometimes I will throw in a bonus question, have a little fun with the bonus question. Or you can use it as a segue into what you're going to talk about when the quiz is done. And then afterwards, we go through it, question by question. So then, okay, well, what is the catalyst? You tell me. And then when I hear your answers, you know, I'll agree with it, or if I disagree, I'll try and redirect it and get them to think about what I wanted them to think about. And then we'll post the answer. And then we go through it line by line. They almost always get number 6 right. Especially since we've had a couple championships in the last 2 years. It's not too hard. And unless they're on their equestrian team, they will not get it. That one. I can say that. And I don't remember, is it 2 equestrian championships that we have? Do you guys know? I want to say that we have, the women have 2. I know it's at least 1. And that was about 2 years ago. You know, you can also have fun with some of that. I did my master's at Georgia, so I you know, like to play with them before the Georgia game, tease them a little. You know, some students need a little bit more convincing. That's a real headline. That's not a joke. Yeah, I was appalled when I saw the headline because my first thought was, as a 15-year-old boy, I knew the answer to this. I didn't need a formal education. You know, a little bit of thought goes a long ways. Yeah, you don't end up with things like that, especially in your policymakers. And then what about your careers? You know, you're taking my class probably because you have some interest in health somewhere along the way, whether it's public health, and all the public health BS majors take my class, but then all the exercise science students do. And there's a variety of things that people want to do. You know, they're not all going to do bench science. They're not all go to medical school and be physical therapists. Different people need different things. So as soon as somebody says, well, why do I need to know this? Besides the fact that it's on the exam and you need to pass the class to keep going, well, you know, you don't know what you're going to need until you need it. And what about the person sitting next to you? You know, they probably have a different career interest, and I have to try and cover material for a lot of people and make it interesting to a variety of different people. You know, try not to make it confrontational. Try and direct it away from that energy because you know they're already defensive. But give them reasons to be serious. All right. And then use slides to help advance what you want to say. I start my semesters off with this one. I think there are 4 things you have to understand in order to know anatomy and physiology. And then I will pause it, and then we'll go through each of these. And as we go through the semester, I said segue. It's not only a segue into the course. I bring these up throughout the semester. I keep bringing them back. If you're going to talk about it one time, you should talk about it several times. All right? It helps with the relevance. It makes it significant. You know, another slide. This is a slide transitioning from the introduction of a chapter into the meat of the chapter. So, and I purposefully use some of these terms. I know segregate is a pretty touchy word, but what does segregate mean? Well, that's why I use it. You know, it's something, it may have a visceral response, but when I put it in context, people typically don't have a problem. You know, I talk about alien invaders. I have a whole slide devoted to that. You know, obviously I'm not talking about extraterrestrial. I am talking about a physiological concept, how your body identifies foreign objects. You know, but you know, have fun with this. This should be a good time. You just can't get caught up into it being a good time. But you have to enjoy it. Don't be afraid to use the Blackboard tools to allow you to help students make connections. So after I've gone through and taught protein synthesis and protein degradation, I have a summary slide. And rather than a bunch of text, which, by the way, I hate text on slides. You know, I give you guys a lot of text because I know you're mature and you can handle it. But this is what I like to give my students. So I talk them about through the process. I remind them about translation that occurs in the nucleus. Transcription in the nucleus, the translation in the cytosol, bring back the whole idea of the mRNA splicing. And if this is a cytosolic protein, this is where folding will take place, and that'll be the end of the story. But if it's a secreted protein, well, then there's an additional set of steps, you know, that involve the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, and eventually we package it in the form of our vesicle until we need to secrete it, or it needs to merge to become part of the membrane. And then how do we get rid of proteins? Well, we focus on cytosolic proteins. So we talk about tagging it. Ubiquitin proteasome pathway. We tag it with ubiquitin. Of course, you have to have your symbol for the enzyme, right? Why not use something fun? And this is how you can summarize what you've talked about without having a bunch of bullet points. You know, you've been in those lectures. Try and minimize that. I mean, sometimes you have to. But sometimes you can do other things. And, you know, enjoy this process. this should not be boring. It should not be stale for you. If you're enjoying it, your students are more likely to enjoy it. That helps with establishing that rapport and that buy-in. Right? And then, as we mentioned early on, don't micromanage, because that will remove most of the joy for you and for them. Micromanaging is stressful. I really discourage it. Besides, they're adults. You're an adult. Don't you want to be treated as one? Well, I mean, they're adults, young, naive in some cases, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be treated like adults. You know, we just have to kind of steer, cajole, poke, prod, and try and keep them moving in the right directions. But don't hold their hand. Don't, force them. All right? So that is my talk. 2 minutes over. I did pretty good. We started 2 minutes late, so I'm right on, right?